This isn't just a trade dispute. This is the moment Trump's strategy started collapsing on the global stage. This is no routine trade dispute, no passing eruption of tariff rhetoric, no familiar burst of campaign-era economic nationalism destined to dissolve into the next news cycle. What is unfolding here is far larger, far more consequential, and far more destabilizing than the headline alone suggests. Canada's hard strike against Donald Trump's trade gamble marks something deeper than retaliation. It marks exposure. It marks the moment a strategy built on pressure, spectacle, and assumed submission runs into the hard limits of power in an interdependent world. And when that happens on the global stage, before allies, rivals, markets, and institutions alike, the consequences travel fast. They move beyond customs duties and border measures. They begin to reshape perceptions of leverage, credibility, and control. That is why this moment matters. That is why this moment matters. That is why this story carries the weight of a structural turning point. The public narrative will try to simplify it. One side imposed pressure, the other side pushed back. Negotiations intensified, headlines multiplied. But that is the shallow reading, and shallow readings miss the true character of geopolitical shocks. The deeper reality is this. Trump's trade strategy has always depended on a central assumption that forceful disruption creates compliance, that economic intimidation produces strategic advantage, and that partners with more to lose will blink first. Canada's response strikes directly at that assumption, not just materially but symbolically, not just in economic terms but in the hierarchy of international power itself. Because when one of Washington's closest partners refuses to absorb pressure quietly, refuses to validate the script, and instead turns resistance into a demonstration of strategic resilience, the wager begins to collapse under its own logic. And once that logic breaks, it does not break privately. It breaks in full view of the world. That is the essential point. This is not simply about who pays more at the border or which industry feels the first blow. It is about what happens when coercive trade politics ceases to project strength and begins to advertise miscalculation. Trump's gamble was never only economic, it was theatrical. It was designed to show dominance, to reinforce a political image of uncompromising force, to tell domestic audiences that allies had taken advantage of American patience and would now face consequences. But on the world stage, performance can become vulnerability with astonishing speed. The spectacle of pressure only works if the target appears cornered. If the target stands firm, if the target answers with discipline, if the target turns the confrontation into a referendum on reliability, rules, and long-term trust, then the initiator faces a very different outcome. Not the turns, not submission, exposure. And Canada is not just any target. That is where the strategic magnitude becomes unmistakable. Canada is not a distant rival, not a geopolitical adversary, not an easy caricature for domestic mobilization. It is a foundational neighbor, a treaty ally, a deeply integrated economic partner, and a country whose political style is often underestimated precisely because it is measured. When a country like that strikes back hard, the signal is amplified. It tells the world that the issue is not simply bilateral friction. It tells the world that even within the closest circles of Western alignment, confidence in unilateral economic aggression has limits. That matters immensely, because the health of a major power is measured not only by its ability to coerce enemies, but by its ability to sustain trust among allies. When trade becomes a weapon against your own strategic ecosystem, you are not demonstrating command. You are testing the load-bearing walls of your own position. Canada's power in this moment is not rooted in raw size alone. It is rooted in asymmetry understood correctly. Trump's calculation likely presumed that the larger economy automatically holds the superior hand. In crude arithmetic, that appears obvious, but statecraft is not crude arithmetic. It is the management of interdependence. It is the ability to identify where dependency runs both ways, where timing matters more than scale, where institutional sympathy can be mobilized, and where reputational costs can outweigh immediate material pressure. Canada, in responding hard, converts its apparent vulnerability into strategic precision. It does not need to overpower the United States in the abstract. It needs to demonstrate that the use of pressure against it carries wider costs for supply chains, for allied confidence, for legal credibility, for diplomatic alignment, for the very image of American steadiness. That is how smaller or mid-sized powers alter the battlefield, not by matching mass, but by widening consequence. The phrase strikes hard, therefore, should not be understood narrowly. Hard power in trade is not only tariffs for tariffs, measure for measure. It is institutional resistance. It is political calm under pressure. It is targeted retaliation, where pain becomes visible. It is alliance messaging that isolates the aggressor rather than the target. It is the transformation of a bilateral dispute into a global lesson about overreach. Canada's hard strike is the refusal to behave like a disposable subordinate inside an unequal relationship. It is the assertion that proximity does not mean passivity, that integration does not mean surrender, and that dependency, when organized intelligently, can be turned into leverage of its own. That changes the psychology of the confrontation. Suddenly, the larger actor is no longer dictating the story unchallenged. Suddenly, the supposedly smaller player is determining how the story is interpreted abroad. And that is where Trump's trade gamble begins to collapse on the world stage. Not necessarily in one dramatic instant, but in the cumulative unraveling of its intended meaning. The aim was to project command. The effect is to raise questions about judgment. The aim was to display strength. The effect is to remind every observer that strength misapplied becomes self-diminishing. The aim was to force recalibration in Canada. The effect may well be recalibration everywhere else. Allies watch this and ask a simple question. If this is how Washington treats one of its closest partners, what security is there in economic alignment without political insulation? Markets watch and ask whether strategic volatility has become structural. Rival powers watch and conclude that Western cohesion is more fragile than it appears. None of that is incidental. All of it is consequential. The distinction between a tactical event and a systemic shift must be kept firmly in view. Technically, this may appear as a dispute over trade terms, industrial protections, retaliatory measures, or prestige politics. Systemically, it is a case study in the erosion of hegemonic efficiency. The greatest powers do not simply prevail because they possess more capacity. They prevail because they deploy capacity in ways that preserve legitimacy, predictability, and coalition confidence. Once power begins to operate primarily through shock, improvisation, and fret inflation, it becomes less effective even when it remains formidable. That is the paradox of this moment. The United States remains enormous, its market power remains real, its strategic reach remains vast, but the efficacy of that power depends on how others interpret its use. And when Canada's resistance turns the episode into a warning about destabilizing one's own architecture of trust, the damage is no longer confined to trade. This is why the world is paying such close attention. Canada's response becomes more than national self-defense. It becomes a test case. If pressure from Washington can be resisted, answered, and politically reframed by a highly integrated ally, then other states begin to imagine greater room for maneuver. Europe notices, Asian partners notice, middle powers notice, even governments that privately prefer American leadership notice that leadership becomes less reassuring when it is fused with punitive volatility. The effect is subtle at first, then compounding. Countries diversify, contracts shift, strategic conversations widen, new hedging behaviors appear in boardrooms and ministries alike. No single move announces the end of confidence. Instead, confidence thins. It frays at the edges. And in geopolitics, fraying is often the beginning of transformation. There's also a domestic versus global contradiction at the center of Trump's trade style that this confrontation exposes with unusual clarity. Domestically, confrontational trade politics can appear decisive, sovereign, muscular. It offers a clear villain, a clear gesture, a clear performance of grievance turned into action. But global systems do not reward symbolism in the same way electorates do. Global systems punish unpredictability. They price in disruption. They interpret conflict through long memory and second-order effects. A move that appears politically resonant at home can look strategically careless abroad. And when Canada responds not with panic, but with disciplined counter-pressure, it forces that contradiction into the open. The applause line becomes a supply chain problem. The campaign posture becomes an alliance problem. The domestic victory lap becomes an international credibility test. That translation from spectacle into consequence is where gambles fail. There's a deeper strategic irony here as well. Trade coercion is often justified as a method of national restoration, a way to recover lost leverage, reassert sovereignty, and compel fairer treatment. But when used recklessly against essential partners, it can produce the opposite outcome. It accelerates adaptation away from the coercer. It turns trust into caution. It encourages others to build buffers, alternatives, and workarounds. In other words, it trains the system to become less dependent on the very power attempting to dominate it. That is not restoration. That is induced insulation. Canada's hard response carries precisely that danger for Trump's approach, because once a partner decides that the relationship itself must be redesigned to withstand future pressure, the initiator may win a round of headlines, yet lose a larger battle over long-term centrality. This is where the language of collapse must be understood correctly. Collapse on the world stage does not necessarily mean immediate defeat in a legal or numerical sense. It means narrative collapse. It means strategic collapse. It means the intended image of events disintegrates under scrutiny. Instead of a display of irresistible leverage, the world sees a major power consuming political capital to pressure a close ally in receiving resistance that broadens the damage. Instead of a disciplined campaign for advantage, the world sees a gamble whose hidden costs rise faster than its visible gains. Instead of commanding the strategic environment, the initiator appears increasingly trapped inside the compulsions of its own method. This is how authority begins to erode, not always through military setback or economic crisis, but through repeated demonstrations that force is being used without a clear path to durable advantage. Canada's importance in this story also lies in what it represents institutionally. It embodies a model of politics that is procedural, rules-based, and deeply embedded in formal structures of cooperation. That model has often been mocked as slow, overly cautious, and ill-suited to an age of disruption. Yet, in confrontations like this, those very qualities become assets. Measured response can outperform impulsive escalation. Institutional credibility can outperform emotional theatrics. International sympathy can become a form of strategic depth. Canada's hard strike, then, is not only a policy response. It is a demonstration that modern geopolitical resilience may belong not to the loudest actor, but to the actor best able to integrate law, diplomacy, economics, and perception into a coherent line of defense. That is an extremely important lesson, and it will not be lost on observers. The implications for North America are especially serious. This is the most integrated continental economic space on Earth, bound not only by trade, but by infrastructure, energy, logistics, defense cooperation, and social proximity. Disrupt that architecture recklessly, and the damage does not remain abstract. It enters factories, transport corridors, investment plans, agricultural networks, and consumer expectations. But beyond economics, it also enters strategic planning. A relationship once assumed to be reflexively stable begins to require contingencies. Policymakers begin to ask what once seemed unnecessary: how much redundancy is needed, how much exposure is too much, how many assumptions about political continuity are now unsafe. That is a major shift. Mature strategic systems are built on stable assumptions. When those assumptions crack, the repair costs are immense. Security consequences follow from that erosion. Even if they are not immediately visible in the trade file itself, Canada and the United States do not operate in separate strategic universes. They share continental defense imperatives, Arctic concerns, intelligence relationships, and broader alliance responsibilities. When economic relations are politicized at high intensity, trust does not remain compartmentalized as officials may hope. Political atmospheres bleed across sectors, skepticism deepens, strategic alignment becomes more conditional, more transactional, more exposed to public friction. This does not mean immediate rupture. It means something more dangerous in the long run: the normalization of uncertainty between partners who cannot afford it. And in a period of global volatility, uncertainty between allies is not a side effect. It is a gift to every rival watching. Those rivals are watching closely. They do not need to intervene directly. They only need to observe the pattern. Every episode in which Western unity appears vulnerable to internal coercion strengthens the argument that the liberal order is less coherent than advertised. Every moment in which allied interdependence becomes a source of punishment rather than stability invites alternative alignments, or at least more aggressive hedging. In that sense, this story is not just about Canada and Trump. It is about the wider contest over how the international system will be organized in the years ahead. Will it remain anchored by trust-enhancing coordination among advanced democracies, or will it slide further into transactional rivalry, even within alliances themselves? Canada's response makes that question impossible to ignore. The economic dimension reaches further than tariffs, because trade is never just trade at this level. Trade is structure. It determines investment geography, technological ecosystems, resource flows, bargaining hierarchies, and the political imagination of what dependence means. When Canada strikes back hard, it is signaling that access cannot be severed from respect, and integration cannot survive indefinitely if it is treated as a one-way instrument of leverage. That principle matters beyond one dispute. It touches the future of supply chains, industrial policy, and cross-border capital. It erases the possibility that what once looked like efficient integration may now be judged through a new lens: resilience against politicized pressure. That shift would alter corporate behavior, regulatory posture, and national planning for years to come. Once again, what appears tactical reveals itself as structural. It is worth pausing on the word gamble. A gamble is not simply a risk. It is a risk taken on the belief that the probabilities are favorable and the other players will react predictably. Trump's trade approach has often rested on that kind of confidence, the belief that raw pressure would force faster concessions than cautious diplomacy, that fear of disruption would overpower institutional patience, that domestic political rewards justified external turbulence. But gambles fail when one crucial assumption is wrong. In this case, the assumption may have been that Canada would absorb the blow, seek quiet accommodation, and avoid a wider test of wills. Instead, Canada appears to have recognized the deeper stakes and responded in a way designed not merely to survive the confrontation, but to redefine it. That is what turns risk into miscalculation. That is what turns that assertion into retreat, even before retreat is formally acknowledged. And now the broader interpretive battlefield comes into view. In international politics, perception is not decoration, it is currency. If leaders, investors, diplomats, and publics around the world conclude that Trump's trade pressure has produced fragmentation rather than submission, doubt rather than deference, then the symbolic cost becomes enormous. Power depends on expectations. It depends on the widespread belief that pressure will work, that threats are measured, that the initiator understands the system it is attempting to dominate. Lose that belief, and every future act of coercion becomes harder, more expensive, less credible. The immediate issue may be bilateral. The reputational consequences are not. They radiate outward. They condition the next crisis before it begins. There is another contrast here that should not be overlooked: the short-term optics of action versus the long-term reality of strategic position. In the short term, disruption looks dynamic. It creates movement, attention, and the illusion of command. In the long term, however, strategic position is determined by who can build enduring arrangements, who can preserve confidence across shocks, who can turn interdependence into advantage rather than fear. Canada's hard strike suggests an awareness of the long game. It signals that this is not merely about absorbing or countering a current blow. It is about defining the terms on which future relations will operate. That is a more sophisticated objective. It is colder, it is slower, and very often it is more effective, because the actor thinking in systems can outlast the actor thinking in episodes. Historically, major powers do not decline only when they are defeated by stronger enemies. They also decline when they repeatedly convert advantages into liabilities through overreach, impatience, and strategic self-harm. They burden relationships that should have been cultivated. They treat dependence as absolute when it is conditional. They mistake fear for respect. They confuse noise with influence. This episode carries an echo of that pattern. Not a final verdict, not an irreversible endpoint, but a warning shot across the architecture of power. The world stage is unforgiving in precisely this way. It magnifies not only strength, but error. And error has become far more consequential when they involve close partners, because the signal to everyone else is immediate. If even this relationship can be destabilized by performative coercion, then no relationship is fully insulated. Canada, meanwhile, emerges from this not necessarily stronger in absolute terms, but more consequential in relative terms. It becomes a hinge state in a debate far larger than itself: how allies respond when order is strained from within, how middle powers defend sovereignty without theatrical excess, how disciplined resistance can puncture narratives of inevitability. That elevation matters. It changes how Ottawa will be viewed in future disputes. It changes how policymakers elsewhere will interpret the strategic utility of firmness. And it changes the moral framing of the confrontation. Canada is no longer merely the neighboring economy pushed into a dispute. It becomes the demonstration that pressure can be answered without panic, that scale is not destiny, and that strategic maturity can sometimes achieve what brute leverage cannot. What happens next will matter profoundly, because the first shock is never the whole story. The second and third order consequences are where the true transformation usually occurs. Will other states now accelerate economic diversification away from political exposure? Will alliance management become more defensive, more formalized, more legally insulated from leadership volatility? Will domestic audiences in multiple countries begin to treat economic nationalism less as a sign of revival and more as a source of systemic instability? These are not academic questions. They go directly to the future shape of globalization, the durability of North American integration, and the credibility of coercive statecraft in an interconnected era. The story is still moving. The architecture is still settling. The final balance has not yet been written. But one conclusion is already difficult to escape. Canada's hard strike has revealed that Trump's trade gamble was never simply a contest of tariffs. It was a test of whether disruption could substitute for strategy, whether forceful rhetoric could override the mechanics of trust, whether a politics of pressure could dominate a world that is increasingly adaptive, networked, and alert to reputational risk. On that larger test, the signs are ominous for the gamble's architects, because once the world sees coercion failing to produce alignment, sees resistance producing sympathy, sees allies recalculating, and institutions reasserting themselves, the center of gravity shifts, quietly at first, then unmistakably. And that is why this moment should be understood as a warning, a revelation, and perhaps the opening chapter of a larger geopolitical realignment. Not because one dispute decides history, but because certain confrontations expose the underlying logic of an era. This one does exactly that. It shows how power can falter when it mistakes proximity for obedience. It shows how a supposedly secondary actor can become the site of strategic reversal. It shows how the world stage punishes gambles that confuse intimidation with durable influence. Canada's response has done more than answer pressure. It has illuminated the fragility of a method, the limits of spectacle, and the cost of treating the international system as a theater for unilateral compulsion. The full consequences have not yet arrived. That is precisely what makes this so consequential. The shock is here.